Welcome to Fierce Queen's Reckoning. I'm so glad you could join us today. Now, let's dive right into the story. The real estate developer pulled up to a crumbling Victorian house on the outskirts of Winnipeg in a custom black Range Rover, his 24-year-old girlfriend draped across the passenger seat like a decorative accessory, carrying a check for $40,000 and a smirk he had been rehearsing for 6 years. He had come to watch his ex-wife sign away the last thing she had left. He had come to see the defeat in her eyes, up close, in person, the way a man like Harlan Whitmore needed to see things to believe they were real. What he did not know, what neither of them could have possibly imagined standing on that cracked driveway in the October wind, was that the woman who opened that door had spent 6 years building something so quietly, so methodically, so invisibly, that the moment he walked through it, his entire financial empire would begin to disintegrate in real time. The check in his pocket would not be enough to cover a single hour of the legal fees that had already been filed against him that morning. And the girlfriend, the one clutching a glossy designer bag and wrinkling her nose at the peeling paint on the porch, would be in a rideshare to the airport before the sun went down. Chapter 1. The Man Who Came to Gloat. Harlan Whitmore was 51 years old and looked exactly the way a self-made man from Manitoba wanted the world to see him. Broad-shouldered, a jaw that had been hardened by decades of boardroom posturing, silver at the temples, which he wore with the calculated vanity of a man who believed it communicated authority rather than age. He drove a custom black Range Rover with heated everything and a surround sound system that cost more than most people's first cars. His property development firm, Whitmore Land Group, was on the verge of finalizing a landmark mixed-use project in downtown Winnipeg, a deal worth approximately $180 million in projected revenue over a decade, and he had personally ensured that every financial publication in Western Canada knew his name in connection with it. Sitting beside him, refusing to acknowledge the gray November sky pressing down on the Transcona neighborhood, was Kylie. Kylie was 24. She had a lifestyle brand on Instagram, a remarkably confident opinion on everything she had never personally experienced, and a collection of handbags that Harlan funded entirely. She was pressing her gel-manicured fingers against the heated window and shuddering with exaggerated revulsion at the street outside. "Harlan, this is actually depressing," Kylie announced, pulling her cashmere wrap tighter around her shoulders. "Does she not have, like a neighbor who could mow the boulevard? Why is the gutter falling off?" Harlan did not answer immediately. He was looking at the house at 14 Braemar Crescent. It was a late Victorian double-story in a state of visible deterioration. The exterior wood siding had gone unpainted for years. The porch railing leaned at an uncomfortable angle. A large crack split the front walkway cleanly in two. He had signed over the deed to this house in the divorce settlement 6 years ago. He had done it because his lawyers had assessed it as a liability. The restoration costs alone would have eclipsed any reasonable market value at the time. He had handed it to his ex-wife, Cecily Brandt, like a consolation prize, like a small, crumbling joke. He had told her, in the mediation room in the Exchange District with 3 lawyers behind him, and not a single tremor of guilt in his voice, that she should take it and be grateful. He had expected her to collapse under the weight of it. Instead, she had signed the papers, taken her single box of personal effects, and vanished so completely from his social orbit that he had almost forgotten she existed. Almost. "Stay close to me," Harlan told Kylie, stepping out onto the cracked driveway. "This won't take long. She's going to sign, we're going to leave, and we'll be at High's for dinner by 7. Kylie climbed out of the Range Rover and immediately looked down at the driveway with open disdain, stepping carefully around a patch of frost-heaved concrete in her suede ankle boots. "I don't understand why you didn't just send a courier," she said, linking her arm through his. "Your lawyers have people for this. Because I want to see her face," Harlan said simply. "When she signs." He walked up the broken front path with the easy stride of a man who had never once questioned whether he belonged somewhere. He raised his fist and knocked on the front door. For a moment, there was only the sound of a distant dog and the low wind moving through the bare Manitoba elms. Then the deadbolt turned. The door opened. Cecily Brandt stood in the threshold, and Harlan experienced something he was entirely unprepared for: the involuntary, unwanted, biological recognition of a woman who had gotten more beautiful in the years since he had discarded her. She was 42. Her hair, dark and loosely pinned, had a single streak of silver at the left temple that she wore without apology. She was dressed in a pair of oatmeal-colored wide-leg trousers and a thick, unbranded navy pullover. No logos. No jewelry except for a single slim gold watch on her left wrist. Her dark eyes settled on Harlan with a steadiness that was not warmth, not hostility, not surprise. Just a calm, comprehensive appraisal, the way a structural engineer looks at a wall before deciding whether it needs to come down. "Harlan," she said. Her voice was low and even, the kind of voice that did not need volume to fill a room. "I wasn't expecting a personal visit." "Well," Harlan said, recovering quickly, puffing up with the reflexive pride of a man who needed to be the largest presence in any space. "Some things are worth doing in person." Kylie stepped forward from behind his shoulder, doing the thing she always did when she wanted to establish territory, inserting herself into the sightline. "Hi," Kylie said, her voice tilted with a very particular kind of false brightness. "I'm Kylie, Harlan's fiancée." The word fiancé was delivered with a small, precise emphasis, like placing a pin on a map. "He talks about you sometimes." "Not much. Just, in the context of, well, all of this." She made a vague gesture at the house. Cecily looked at Kylie with an expression of polite neutrality so complete and composed that Kylie almost flinched. "A pleasure," Cecily said. Then, after the briefest of pauses, "You're very young." It was not said unkindly. It was said with the mild observational tone of someone noting the weather, which somehow made it significantly worse. "We'd like to come in," Harlan said, pulling a slim leather document folder from under his arm. "There's a matter I need to discuss with you. Paperwork. It won't take long." Cecily's eyes dropped to the folder. Something shifted in her expression. Not alarm, not anxiety. It was quieter than either of those things. It was the look of someone who had been expecting a particular move on a board for a very long time, and was now watching it finally arrive. "Of course," she said, and pulled the door open wide. "Come in." Chapter 2. The House That Should Have Been a Ruin. Harlan stepped into the entryway. It was dim. The original Victorian plaster walls were stripped back in places to bare lath, and the floor beneath his shoes was rough, unfinished hardwood. He noted the dust on the old light fixture above the door. He noted a stack of architectural drawings, rolled up in the umbrella stand by the coat rack. He noted, with some satisfaction, that the place still smelled of an old house. Plaster, cold air, the particular mustiness of a building that had not been properly maintained. "Mind the entryway," Cecily said, moving ahead of them down the narrow corridor. "The Heritage Registry has very specific rules about what I can do with the original street-facing facade." Harlan almost smiled. Heritage Registry. Of course. She was probably spending whatever modest alimony she had saved, trying to preserve a crumbling pile of Victorian sentiment in a neighborhood no serious developer would touch. They followed her through the entryway, turned the corner past a load-bearing wall, and stopped. Harlan's leather document folder slipped from his grip and hit the floor with a flat smack. He did not bend to pick it up. The back half of the house had been completely, surgically, breathtakingly transformed. The ceiling had been raised to original height and then opened further, a long skylight running the full length of the upper story, flooding the space below with a column of cold northern light that turned everything it touched to silver and gold. The walls were original brick, but they had been cleaned, repointed, and sealed to a deep burgundy warmth. The floors were wide white oak planks, almost pale as bone, utterly seamless. In the center of the main room, an enormous custom sectional in charcoal boiled wool faced a double-sided gas fireplace suspended from a ceiling beam. The kind of fireplace Harlan had priced for a show suite 2 years ago and abandoned when the quote came back at $40,000. Beyond the living area was a kitchen of extraordinary restraint, honed black granite, flat-panel walnut cabinetry, a full-height thermidor refrigerator, a copper farmhouse sink that caught the light like something hammered by hand because it was. A Le Cornu range in matte black and polished nickel sat against the far wall like an altar. Above the fireplace hung a painting Harlan recognized. He recognized it because he had been at the auction in Toronto where it had sold. A large format oil by a Haida artist, whose work had tripled in value in the last 4 years. He had bid on it. He had lost the bid to an anonymous telephone buyer and spent the subsequent dinner complaining about it to his then associate, Eleanor. He started and then stopped because her name was Cecily, and the fact that he had reached for the wrong name in his own panic was a humiliation he immediately tried to bury. "Please, sit down," Cecily said, gesturing to the dining table. It was a single slab of live-edge maple, nearly 3 meters long, supported by hand-welded steel legs. Around it sat 8 chairs in tobacco-brown leather and bent black steel. Originals, Harlan realized, his eye catching the maker's mark on the nearest chair's back. He knew that mark. He'd tried to source those for a client 2 years ago and been told there was a 2-year wait list. "What is this?" Harlan said. It was not quite a question. "My home," Cecily said simply, and moved into the kitchen to fill a copper-bottomed kettle. Kylie stood frozen near the doorway. She had gone very still, which was not a natural condition for her. Her eyes moved across the room with the rapid, recalibrating focus of someone whose internal hierarchy had just been violently reshuffled. She looked at the painting. She looked at the kitchen. She looked at her own bag, an investment piece she had been very proud of 3 minutes ago. And something shifted in her posture, a very slight deflation. Harlan lowered himself into one of the maple chairs and set the document folder on the table. He needed to regain the upper hand. He told himself the renovation was probably bank financed to the hilt. A woman like Cecily, who had been a structural engineer before the marriage, and then, at his suggestion, stepped back from practice to manage the household and support his business, would not have the liquidity for a project like this. She was house poor. She had to be. She had leveraged everything she had to transform a crumbling Transcona Victorian into a showpiece no one would ever see. It was the most Cecily thing he could imagine. Brilliant and entirely impractical. "I won't waste your time," Harlan said, recovering enough to open the folder. "You may have read that Whitmore Land Group is in the final stages of the railside development. $180 million in projected revenue. We are set to close with our institutional backers at the end of this month." He slid a thick stack of stapled documents across the maple table. "During the final due diligence review, our legal team flagged an anomaly in the original land assembly. A parcel that forms the eastern boundary of the railside site, Lot 4B in the survey, was assessed and optioned 6 months before we separated. Your name appears in the initial site assessment report as co-author." Cecily was watching him from the kitchen, her expression unchanged, the kettle beginning its low hum on the range. "I co-authored it because I wrote the structural viability assessment," Cecily said. "You know that." "Yes, well," Harlan said, the slight tightening of his jaw the only indication that the sentence had landed. "Our institutional partners at Cardinal Capital want the chain of title completely clean before the wire transfer. The documents I need you to sign are a standard release of any co-authorship interest in the preliminary assessment, and a confirmatory waiver of any advisory claim to the initial site option." He reached into the folder and produced a certified check. He slid it across the table beside the documents. $40,000, tax-free, for your signature today. The check landed on the maple surface with a soft whisper of paper. Cecily picked up her ceramic mug, hand-thrown, unglazed, the kind of thing that cost $300 at a craft studio and looked like it cost nothing, and walked slowly to the table. She sat down across from Harlan. She looked at the check. She looked at the documents. Then she looked at Harlan with the patient, unhurried steadiness of someone who had been sitting in a blind with a very precise view of the horizon, and had just seen exactly what they came to see step into the clearing. "Harlan," she said quietly. $40,000. Kylie, attempting to reassert her relevance, slid into the chair beside Harlan and reached across the table to tap the check with one manicured finger. "It's generous," she said, her voice finding something like its earlier confidence. "Honestly, for a co-author credit on a preliminary report 6 years ago, it is very generous. You should take it and just move on, Start fresh." She looked around the room with a bright, performative smile. "You clearly have a lovely little project going here." Cecily looked at Kylie. Just looked at her. The way you look at a road sign in a language you don't speak. Then she looked back at Harlan. "The structural viability assessment for Lot 4B, Cecily said, setting her mug down with a soft, deliberate clink. "When did your legal team find my name on it?" 3 weeks ago, Harlan said. "And when did you first contact Cardinal Capital about the railside financing?" Harlan frowned. "That's not relevant." 4 months ago, Cecily said. "I know, because Cardinal Capital's due diligence team contacted me directly 8 weeks ago. Not your lawyers, not a courier. Cardinal Capital's own infrastructure review officer, a woman named Patricia Kwong, called me at my office." Harlan went very still. "My office?" Cecily repeated, because she understood exactly what she was doing by saying those words. "I have been a licensed structural and environmental engineer in private practice for 5 years, Harlan. I reopened my firm 14 months after the divorce. Brant Engineering. We are currently registered with the City of Winnipeg, the Province of Manitoba, and 4 federal infrastructure programs. She reached into the pocket of her wide-legged trousers and placed a slim, matte black phone on the table between them. Patricia Kwong didn't call me about the co-authorship release, Cecily said. She called me because their internal review team had discovered something your lawyers apparently missed in the original land assembly. She paused. The structural viability assessment for Lot 4B was the document that validated the site for mixed-use high-density development. Without it, the city's 2018 rezoning application would not have gone forward. Without the rezoning, Cardinal Capital would have no approved development zone to finance. The room was completely quiet, except for the soft sound of the kettle which had clicked off. That assessment, Cecily said, was authored by me, filed under my professional engineer's seal, and submitted 6 months before the incorporation of Whitmore Land Group's railside subsidiary. It predates any corporate claim your company could make to the underlying analysis. Chapter 3. The Weight of a Seal. Harlan stared at her. Something had drained from his face. Not just color, but the particular quality of ambient certainty that men like him carried into every room like luggage. You signed away your advisory interests in the divorce, he said. The word divorce came out slightly unsteady, and he knew it. I signed away my equity interest in Whitmore Land Group, Cecily said, with the careful precision of someone quoting from memory. I signed away my rights to the brand, the corporate accounts, and the active project portfolio at the time of separation. I could not legally, sign away an independently held professional credential. My peeing seal is registered to me personally. It cannot be transferred by contract. Your divorce lawyers either didn't understand that, or they assumed I didn't. She tapped the matte black phone once. Patricia Kwong called me because Cardinal Capital's legal team understood it perfectly. A development site, whose foundational regulatory approval rests on an engineering assessment filed under a private professional seal. A seal that was never contractually incorporated into the Whitmore Land Group portfolio, creates a significant title liability. That is, Harlan started and then stopped because his throat had gone dry in a way that he was not accustomed to and could not immediately correct. Cardinal Capital sent me their preliminary position letter 4 weeks ago, Cecily said. They were asking whether I would be willing to provide a confirmatory letter of professional reliance. Essentially, a letter reaffirming the assessment's integrity and my ongoing professional endorsement of the structural data so they could proceed with clean title. She picked up her mug. I told them I needed some time to consider and, Harlan said. The word barely made it out. And I spoke with my legal counsel, Cecily said, and I filed a professional notice with the Association of Professional Engineers of Manitoba, formally documenting that the structural assessment for Lot 4B railside remains under my professional seal and that no confirmatory endorsement has been granted. She looked at him. That notice was filed 17 days ago. Your Cardinal Capital financing cannot close with an unresolved liability on the foundational site document. That's not my opinion. That's the regulatory framework of Manitoba. Harlan reached into his jacket and pulled out his phone. His hands were moving with the too-fast energy of a man trying to look like he is not panicking. He found his general counsel's number and pressed call, putting it on speaker without thinking, without asking, in a reflex of desperation. The line rang twice. Harlan. The voice that came through the speaker was Andrew Foss, general counsel for Whitmore Land Group, and he sounded like a man who had not slept in 3 days. Tell me you didn't go to Braemar Crescent, Andrew, Harlan said, leaning toward the phone on the maple table. I'm here. I'm with Cecily. There's a PN. Notice filed with the APM. Tell me that's not going to hold up the Cardinal close. A long silence. Harlan, Andrew said carefully. I found out about the APM notice on Monday. I've been trying to reach you. What does it mean? Another silence, heavier than the first. It means Cardinal's legal team flagged it in the title search this morning, Andrew said. They're not willing to proceed to close with the notice on record. They need either a clean professional endorsement from Cecily or, and this is their language, not mine, a re-engineering of the foundational assessment by a new PEng at their cost. So get a new engineer, Harlan said. Harlan. Andrew's voice dropped. The rezoning was issued based specifically on Cecily's assessment methodology. The city's approval is tied to her credentials as the assessing engineer. If we bring in a new PEng and they produce a revised assessment, the rezoning has to go back through City Council. That's a minimum of 18 months. Kylie turned to Harlan. Her face had lost its studied prettiness. What was underneath it was something rawer, the expression of someone doing mathematics in their head and not liking the answer. Babe, she said. Her voice had gone flat and unfamiliar. What does 18 months mean? Harlan ignored her. Andrew, you're telling me the entire railside close is contingent on her cooperation. Her professional endorsement, Andrew said, because the distinction mattered. Yes. Harlan looked across the table at Cecily. Cecily was holding her mug in both hands. She looked back at him with an expression of complete, unshakable composure. There was no performance in it. There was no vindictive heat. There was only the composed steadiness of a woman who had done the technical work, filed the paperwork, and waited for the physics of the situation to do precisely what physics always does. You are bluffing, Harlan said. But there was no weight behind it. It came out like a man saying a word he remembered but could no longer define. Andrew, Cecily said, turning her head slightly toward the phone on the table. Do you want to confirm the APEM notice number for your client? Another pause. And then Andrew Foss read out a 12-digit file reference number in the careful voice of a man reading a diagnosis he had been dreading. Harlan's jaw tightened to the point of visible strain. Kylie pushed back her chair. The bent steel legs scraped against the white oak floor, she said, her voice rising with a new, unmanaged edge. Okay, I need to understand what is happening right now, because I am supposed to be meeting with our event planner tomorrow morning, and the venue deposit on the Fairmont is $60,000 and it's non-refundable, and Kylie, Harlan said. Don't Kylie me. She stood up, and the composed influencer persona had fully evaporated, stripped back to something much younger and much more afraid. You told me this was a formality. You told me this was nothing. You told me you built one of the most successful real estate portfolios in Manitoba, and you didn't read the engineering documents? You didn't know her name was on them? I knew her name was on them, Harlan said quietly. Then why did you think $40,000 would fix it? Kylie demanded, her voice cracking on the final word. Cecily did not look at Kylie with pleasure. She looked at her with something closer to regret, the mild, impersonal regret of watching someone learn a lesson they shouldn't have had to be in the room to learn. Andrew, Harlan said into the phone. What happens if Cardinal walks? Another pause, the longest yet, the kind of silence that has a shape. They lose their financing window for the fiscal year, Andrew said. The Railside Holding subsidiary has carrying costs of approximately $400,000 a month. Without the Cardinal close, we are looking at roughly 11 months of runway before we have to restructure. He paused. And Harlan, the Board of Trade dinner is next week. If the Cardinal deal collapses, it will be in the business press before the weekend. Harlan said nothing. I have to go brief the principals, Andrew said. Don't sign anything. Don't say anything else. The line clicked dead. Chapter 4. The Architecture of Patience. Kylie grabbed her bag off the back of her chair. The bag that, 20 minutes ago, had felt like a statement. Now it just felt like something to hold. I have to go, she said. Her voice had lost all of its earlier music. She looked at Harlan with the wide, calculating eyes of someone totaling a bill they had not expected to pay. I can't. I'm not going to stand here while you try to sort out a deal that's already. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. The math was visible on her face. You're leaving, Harlan said. Not a question. His voice had gone completely flat. I have a brand to protect, Kylie said. I have partnerships. I have a following. I am not going to be photographed outside a development site that's under regulatory review by the city of Winnipeg, Harlan. She pulled her wrap tighter. I'm sorry. I genuinely am. But you told me you were a sure thing. She turned and walked down the dim Victorian hallway toward the front door. Her ankle boots were quieter on the way out than they had been on the way in. The heavy front door closed. Not slammed, just closed. With the quiet finality of a chapter ending. Harlan sat alone at Cecily's maple table, in Cecily's remarkable house, in the neighborhood he had handed her like a joke. He was looking at the $40,000 check resting on the wood beside a stack of legal documents that had, in the space of 20 minutes, gone from being a weapons to being an embarrassment. You planned this, he said. I practiced engineering, Cecily said. I filed my professional documentation according to the regulatory requirements of my profession. I cooperated with Cardinal Capital's due diligence inquiry. She held his gaze. Everything I did was exactly what any licensed professional should do. You waited, Harlan said. 6 years. You could have done this at any point in the last 6 years. Yes, Cecily said. I could have. The silence between them had a weight now. Not the silence of a room. The silence of the distance between who Harlan thought Cecily was and who she had always actually been. 6 years ago, she said, Whitmore Land Group was a mid-sized regional firm with an asset base of $30 million. If I had acted then, you would have restructured, refinanced, and rebuilt. You were too early in your arc. Her voice was not unkind. It was the voice of someone stating geometrical fact. I needed to let you reach the project that required my foundational work. I needed railside. Harlan stared at her. You were building your firm, he said, slowly. For 5 years, she said. Brant Engineering now holds professional contracts with the city, the province, and Infrastructure Canada. We have 11 engineers on staff. We are the assessing firm on 4 active federal projects. She paused. I was not waiting in poverty for you to come back, Harlan. I was working. He pressed both hands flat on the maple table. I'll pay you more, he said, the manic desperation of a man who has only one register when cornered. Whatever Cardinal was paying me, I'll give you a percentage. 10% of the net on railside. That's $18 million in a decade. Cecily looked at him with the mild expression she might use on a contractor who had quoted her double the actual cost of a job. Harlan, she said, I don't need 18% of railside. She picked up her phone. She turned it to face him. It was an email from a name Harlan recognized. Lawrence Patel, Managing Director, Cardinal Capital Infrastructure. The subject line read, Preferred Engineering Partnership, Brant Engineering Group. Harlan read the body, slowly. The words rearranged themselves in front of him several times before he could accept their meaning. Cardinal Capital was offering Brant Engineering a 4-year preferred partnership contract for all structural and environmental assessments on their national infrastructure portfolio. The contract value, outlined in the second paragraph, was $11.3 million. And there was a second paragraph. Cardinal Capital was withdrawing from the railside project with Whitmore Land Group. Their financing window for the fiscal year had been reallocated. They were proceeding with an alternative mixed-use partner in the railside corridor, one whose foundational land documentation had clean title and professional endorsement from the outset. That partner's name was in the final line of the email. Brant Engineering Group, in partnership with OC Development Inc. Harlan, read the line 3 times. You're not the assessing engineer on their deal, he said. You're the development partner. I'm the development partner, Cecily confirmed. She set the phone down on the maple table. Cardinal came to me 6 weeks ago. Not to ask for my endorsement of your site, to ask whether I had any interest in the railside corridor myself. She looked at him steadily. I had submitted a parallel site assessment 18 months ago for a different parcel in the same corridor. One with clean title, fully registered under Brant Engineering, with a co-development proposal attached. They had reviewed it. They liked it. She paused. When their due diligence team found the title complication on your parcel, they went looking for a clean alternative. I was already there. The room was very quiet. The $40,000, Cecily said, glancing at the check on the table, will not cover the filing fees on our building permits. Chapter 5. What 6 years looks like. Harlan sat at the table for a long time after that. Long enough for the autumn light through the skylight to shift. Long enough for Cecily to rinse her mug in the copper farmhouse sink and begin grinding coffee in a hand-crank grinder on the walnut counter. He tried the tactics he knew. He offered money. He offered credit. He offered an arrangement, a referral, a public acknowledgement of her foundational contribution to railside. He offered things that would have mattered 6 years ago, and now landed on the maple table like stones dropped into still water, sound without effect. Cecily listened to each offer with the same composed attention she gave everything, and each time she simply said, No, Harlan, not with heat, not with vindictive satisfaction, with the clean, unencumbered certainty of a woman who had done the mathematics long before this conversation began and had nothing left to calculate. You told me, she said at one point, still facing the coffee grinder, her back to him, in the mediation room, that I had no head for business. You told me that engineers were technicians, not visionaries. You said you needed a partner with commercial instinct, not just technical competence. She poured hot water over the grounds in a slow, controlled spiral. I built a 10-engineer firm in 5 years, she said. I hold federal contracts. I have a development partnership with Cardinal Capital. She turned, holding the ceramic pour-over in both hands. I think I have adequate commercial instinct. Harlan said nothing. What you did not understand, Cecily continued, carrying the pour-over to the table and setting it on the trivet between them, was that I didn't need vision. I needed documentation. I had filed every professional credential, every assessment, every engineering notation, with perfect, auditable precision my entire career. You relied on that precision for years, without ever once reading the documents carefully enough to understand what they meant. She sat down across from him. You signed exactly where I told you to sign, she said, and you were so busy with your launches and your press and your Board of Trade dinners that it never occurred to you to read the title carefully. Harlan looked at the pour-over, at the table, at the painting on the brick wall above the fireplace, the Haida oil he had tried to buy in Toronto and lost to an anonymous telephone buyer. He looked at Cecily. The auction, he said, 2 years ago. In Toronto. Cecily picked up her coffee and said nothing. You were the telephone buyer, he said. She looked at him over the rim of her mug. I wanted that painting very much, she said simply. Harlan stood. The movement was slower than it had been when he arrived. His coat felt heavier. He picked up the document folder, his useless, carefully prepared document folder, and tucked the certified check back inside it. He walked down the dim Victorian hallway toward the front door without looking back. The hardwood under his shoes was rough and unfinished, and somehow that was the detail that stayed with him. That even the floor of her entryway had been considered. The finished floors were inside. The rough floor was for people who were only passing through. He opened the heavy front door. The air outside hit him like the first breath after surfacing from deep water. Cold, necessary, clarifying. He walked down the cracked front path toward the Range Rover. He sat inside. The climate control came on immediately, warming the cabin to exactly the temperature he had programmed, and the leather heated beneath him, and the sound system offered him his own playlist, and none of it helped at all. His phone was already going. He looked at the screen without seeing it for a long time. The cascade of notifications from Andrew, from his board contacts, from 2 business journalists whose numbers he recognized, sliding past like water. He set the phone face down on the passenger seat, in the exact spot where Kylie had been sitting 40 minutes ago. He sat there for a while, in the idling Range Rover outside the crumbling Victorian facade of 14 Braemar Crescent, looking at the peeling paint on the porch and the leaning railing and the cracked walkway that he had handed Cecily Brandt like an afterthought. And he understood, for the first time, what that crack in the walkway actually was. It was a door, and she had walked through it and built an empire on the other side. Chapter 6. The First Quiet Evening. Back inside, the heavy front door closed with a deep, resonant thud that settled into the bones of the house. Cecily stood in the entryway. She listened to the silence return, the house's own particular quiet, the way the restored brick absorbed sound, and the long skylight gathered the last of the afternoon's light and distributed it evenly through every room. She walked back to the main living space. The documents Harlan had left were still on the maple table, slightly disordered from where he had shuffled them in his escalating desperation. The $40,000 check had gone back into the folder and out the door. She straightened the stack of documents he'd left behind, his useless quick-release forms, and moved them to the edge of the table. She would ask her assistant to shred them in the morning. She carried her ceramic mug and the pour-over into the kitchen and set them on the counter. She stood at the copper farmhouse sink for a moment, looking out through the floor-to-ceiling glass at the back of the house, where her private garden held the last of the season in a kind of suspended stillness. The ornamental grasses pale silver, the water in the small reflecting pool black, and still as mercury under the October sky. She had planted that garden in the second summer after the divorce. She had done most of the labor herself on weekends, when the firm's early contracts were quiet and she had more time than money. She had moved every stone by hand. She had leveled the pond herself with a laser transit she'd borrowed from the office. She had found the ornamental grasses at a nursery outside Steinbach on a long drive she had taken one afternoon just to be moving. Because motion was easier than stillness in those early years, she had sat beside that pond on a great many evenings over the last 5 years, with case files and engineering reports spread across a folding table, and had thought through the legal architecture of exactly what she was building and exactly what it would eventually require. Her phone lit up on the kitchen island. She crossed to it and picked it up. There was a message from Lawrence Patel at Cardinal Capital. Cecily, the board has ratified the partnership agreement. Welcome to the Cardinal family. Looking forward to breaking ground together. He had added, after a line break, saw the news coming across the wire about Whitmore. You played that with a lot of patience. Glad we found each other. Below that was a message from her structural lead at Brandt Engineering, a meticulous young woman from Saskatoon, who had been with the firm for 3 years and who Cecily trusted with the precision work. The city's pre-construction meeting for Phase 1 is confirmed for November 14. Do you want me to put together the presentation deck? Cecily typed back, yes please. Use the amended foundation specs from October 12 and order dinner for the team tomorrow night. Cardinal comes through, we celebrate. She set the phone down. She reached for the coffee grinder and a fresh bag of beans, Ethiopian Yirgacheffe, whole bean, from the roaster on Osborne, and began to prepare a second coffee, not because she needed the caffeine, because the ritual of it was satisfying. The small, physical, deliberate action of the grind, the bloom, the pour. 6 years ago, she had sat in a mediation room in the Exchange District of Winnipeg, while 3 lawyers representing her husband explained, in careful corporate language, that her contribution to the professional infrastructure of his business was not quantifiable in a way the courts would recognize, that her name on a preliminary assessment report constituted technical support, not intellectual property, that her professional seal was a service, not an asset. She had listened carefully. She had asked 2 clarifying questions. She had accepted the deed to the Victorian on Braemar Crescent, and then she had gone home, to a furnished studio apartment on the Corydon Strip, because the house was not livable yet, and she had spent one single evening sitting on the floor with a glass of Riesling, feeling the specific, particular grief of a woman who has watched years of work discarded by someone who never understood what the work actually was. One evening, then she had opened her laptop and begun to draft the incorporation documents for Brant Engineering Group. The kettle clicked off. She poured the hot water over the grounds in a long, deliberate spiral and watched the bloom rise, the slow, dark expansion of the coffee releasing its gases, the small evidence of chemistry behaving exactly as expected. She carried the mug to the floor-to-ceiling glass at the back of the house and slid the door open. The cool air came in, smelling of frozen grass and the particular mineral cold of a Manitoba October. She stepped out onto the reclaimed timber deck and stood at the edge of the reflecting pool. The water was absolutely still, black and precise as the surface of a level. A structural engineer's mind never fully leaves the built environment. You are always on some level, assessing the loads, the spans, the tolerances, the foundational conditions. You learn very early that the most important part of any structure is never the part that shows. It is the part underground, the part no one sees, driven deep into the earth holding everything else up. Cecily had spent 6 years driving foundations. She took a long, slow sip of coffee. From somewhere across the neighborhood, a dog was barking, distant, then quiet. The elms along the boulevard were bare now, their branching entirely visible, the architecture of them clean and legible against the pale gray sky. She had always loved trees in winter for exactly that reason. You could finally see what they were actually made of. Her phone chimed once more, softly, from inside the kitchen. She did not move to check it yet. She stood in the cold air for a while longer, holding the warm mug in both hands, watching the water in the reflecting pool hold the last of the fading light, and let the silence of the house settle around her, like something she had built herself, which, of course, she had. If this story stayed with you, if you recognize that particular kind of quiet, determined power, the kind that doesn't need to announce itself, then you're exactly who this channel is for. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. The women in these stories never make noise when they're building. They only make noise when it's done. We'll see you in the next one.